Welcome back to another M&S tutoring video, and in this video we're going to be learning about the population of an ecosystem. And what we're going to be learning today is about the different factors that affect the increase and the decrease in the general population of an ecosystem, as well as how an exponential growth rate of an ecosystem can lead to a plateau at the end. So let's begin with this graph over here. In this graph, you can see that the population of an ecosystem, as always, starts at 0. And when the ecosystem is first starting to thrive, the population of the ecosystem grows in an exponential growth J curve. What this means is the growth of the ecosystem during its first few years of originating grows exponentially. And once it reaches the carrying capacity of such and such ecosystem, the population then begins to plateau, right? And this is the general outlook of any ecosystem, considering that the ecosystem was not impacted by any diseases or invasive species or anything of that sort. So looking at a general population of an ecosystem, you can see that during the start, there is a lot of biotic potential. So during the first few years of an ecosystem, the biotic potential, right, we'll call it BP for now, is everything that's pushing the general population of the ecosystem first. The biotic potential is basically how fast a population can reproduce without an environment having an impact, right? And as you can see, after a few years, the ecosystem has been continuing to thrive. Environmental resistance comes in, right? Environmental resistance really helps the carrying capacity of an ecosystem, help sustain the population. So over here, we'll call it ER for environmental resistance. So what environmental resistance basically is basically the environmental factors that limit and affect the population growth. For example, food, climate, competition, and shelter, right? All these environmental factors resist the population's urge to grow. And using both the biotic potential and the environmental resistance, we can find the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. So what carrying capacity of an ecosystem basically is, it's biotic potential plus the environmental resistance of an ecosystem. So now let's look at what the different types of biotic growth factors are, and what type of different environmental resistance factors there are in an ecosystem. So starting off, some of the biotic growth factors of an ecosystem include, let's say, light, right? We also have temperature, right? Along with temperature, we also have the environment, right? Right. These biotic factors can work both ways for the population of an environment. The population of an environment can have an adequate amount of light, an adequate amount of temperature, and an adequate environment to sustain itself, but it can also have really harsh lights, really harsh temperatures, really harsh environment for the population to thrive. So these factors can work as both an advantage and disadvantage to the increasing population of an ecosystem. So now let's look at moreover the abiotic. Now let's look at some of the biotic factors. Over here, these were the abiotic. Now let's look at more of the biotic factors that can lead to an increase or the decrease of the population of an ecosystem. So some of the biotic factors include the reproduction rate. The reproduction rate is really one of the greatest biotic factors because it's really dependent on how fast animals are able to reproduce in order to increase the population, right? Another biotic factor is the amount of resources, right? An environment with plenty of resources will better be able to sustain a larger population, as many resources mean many more organisms, and many organisms mean a more sustainable food chain. And that really leads to a high population food chain. Another abiotic role that we need to have in an ecosystem is a niche. If the niche between an ecosystem is really strong, the population will begin to thrive. Um, a niche is basically the role every single organism plays in an ecosystem. If every organism has a role to play in the ecosystem, the population will be able to thrive because of the really strong link between the food chain. The last biotic factor, which is a really important one, is competition. If there are, let's say, if there were two main primary consumers in in this ecosystem, um, usually one of them will eventually have to die off as a means of competition. But if there were per se there was only one, or there was a really small limited amount of competition in the ecosystem, both populations will begin to thrive, causing the general population to increase. So those are some of the abiotic and biotic factors that lead to an increase in the population size. What you'll begin to notice is after the population begins to reach its reach its peak, it really begins to plateau, right? It's like a really straight line from there on forward, and there's not many changes in the ecosystem. This is usually really good for an ecosystem, as it means that it's maximizing the amount of resources it has, and it's basically beginning to carry out the maximum population that it can acquire. And you need to really make sure that the environmental resistance and the BP, which in this case is the biotic potential, is really on a match or equal scale, so that the population does not exceed its carrying capacity, or it does not fundamentally decrease the carrying capacity as well. So again, that's been the video on the population of an ecosystem, and in this case, with most ecosystems, it's usually an exponential growth J curve, which is after some time the population begins to plateau, and during the first few early stages of the ecosystem, it's exponentially growing. So I hope you learned something new about how the population of an ecosystem can be, shifted by different abiotic and biotic factors, and if you have any comments or concerns, please feel free to leave it down in the comment section below, and I'll look to get back to you as soon as possible. Other than that, thanks for watching, guys.